what we're going to do for this session. So unfortunately, Maya Gonzalez was unable to make it. She wants to assure us that this isn't some sort of severe health condition, so she's going to be okay. But in any case, she wasn't able to prepare. So what we want to do for this session is I have prepared notes on the piece by EndNotes, which is co-written by Maya and Jean Netton, The Logic of Gender. And I would like to provide a brief summary of that, and then I'll respond to it with a couple points, and then we'll move on to Paul, or then we'll move on to Julia, and she'll respond with a couple points, and then we'll move on to Paul, and he will respond with a couple of points. And then after that, we'll just move to a sort of general discussion, which will take up the bulk of the session. Okay. And just a little bit of background. I wouldn't purport to be an expert in this, but EndNotes is a journal of sorts, not necessarily a formal academic journal. They have, I think, a more specific sort of mandate in terms of what they publish. But I understand that the sort of EndNotes collective, and Julia, you can correct me if I'm wrong with this, but I understand that the EndNotes collective was formed in Brighton in 2005 out of a British collective called Afhiben, and they published periodic journals. And after a conversation with Theorie Communiste, the French sort of ultra-left group, several of them decided to form EndNotes. Though EndNotes, I know their mailing addresses. I just checked. I know their mailing addresses are in London and Oakland, so sort of the Bay Area / UK kind of thing. I think they've increasingly become quite international, and there's a lot of interesting material in there. A lot of commentaries on, ultra-left Marxist thinkers. The first issue, of course, Theorie Communiste, Dauvet. Later on, they develop, I think, more of an original voice. Kamat, of course, Bordega, and a lot of protests of protests as well. Sorry, a lot of profiles of protests as well, which is a bit of a unique feature of their magazine. So, without further ado, this article, The Logic of Gender, has attracted quite a bit of positive attention, I think, because it serves as an insightful and very, very schematic into, the question of gender within capitalism, social reproduction, and indeed the phrase real abstraction is invoked throughout it. So as I said, I'm going to provide a brief summary, then I'll respond, and then the others can respond after that. So at the beginning of this essay, Gonzalez and Netton, and I may abbreviate that simply to Gonzalez as we go on, just so I don't have to say Gonzalez and Netton, for the next 40 times. They talk about how Marxism sometimes has a tendency, or social reproduction theory, sometimes has a tendency to apply misleading binaries, right? Productive and reproductive, paid and unpaid, public and private, gender. So what, in a sense, the goal of this essay is, I think, is to elucidate the economic structures which have given rise to this sort of thinking, which is perhaps approximately correct in a sense, but also can be misleading. So the first section of the essay is called Production and Reproduction. And in this section of the essay, Marx is discussed, and particularly his comment, I think, in the 6th chapter of Capital, in which, when he's discussing the reproduction of labor power, he reduces the reproduction of labor power to the time required for the reproduction of its, quote, means of subsistence. So this would suggest, its value, the value of labor power, which is reproduced, or the reproductive process, only involves the assist of dead labor. But in a way, like, the inadequacy of this formulation implies that there must be, in a sense, an exterior to value, right, that's involved in the reproduction of labor power. That is to say, in the, to give a very sort of schematic example, I could say in terms of raising children, right, so that their labor power can be commodified, right? You can't reduce that to dead labor. There has to be something else there. So that's how she sort of starts. And what she goes on extracting from this, she proposes a division of which MM and IMM spheres. So the DMM sphere is the directly market mediated sphere, and the IMM sphere is the indirectly market mediated sphere. Whereas the latter has sometimes been described as the socially reproductive sphere. This is inadequate, specifically in the sense that there's sometimes a tendency within social reproduction theory, Federici and so on, to sort of reify these activities in terms of saying, this is, and there are different formulations, but you could talk about, feminized labor, socially reproductive labor. What this isn't capturing is the actual economic relationship that's fundamental. So for directly market mediated activities, which are waged activities, right? And then we have indirectly market mediated activities, of which, quote, to which, quote, social reproduction could be assimilated in a sense, which are essential to the reproduction of labor power, but that do not function directly within the circuits of value, right? Or directly there very, very deliberately, because it is indeed essential. In the indirectly market mediated sphere, Gonzalez and Netton tell us, socially necessary labor time is never directly a factor. And I'm wondering here if she's not thinking of Tumba's sort of formulas, right? But if you think of raising a child, it's difficult quantitatively in the same way that you would organize, the conventional working day, right, in the DMM sphere. Right? This is something that you're always sort of doing. Right? The next section of the essay is called "Paid and Unpaid." Gonzalez and Netton criticize the usage of the phrase "unpaid labor" to describe, socially reproductive labor, or perhaps more accurately, indirectly market-mediated activities, because what they point out is that this elides the fact that even directly market-mediated labor, right, waged labor, is not paid, right, in the sense that there is a sort of gap there, which is constitutive of surplus value, right? So this is a sort of critique they enact at that point. They also point out here, I think quite crucially, that indirectly market-mediated activities can actually be waged, right? And so this is part of the inadequacy of this sort of binary thinking, right? If we think of, a daycare, for example, right, that's organized by the state, this is essential for the reproduction of labor power. It doesn't directly create value, but people can still be waged in order to do that, right? So again, we have to separate out sort of the content of this labor from the form in which it occurs. The third section, private and public. In this section, it's discussed how, for Marx, the private and public division is necessary to facilitate the flexibility which permits capital accumulation. So in a sense, the state withdraws from the private domain, which allows for the organization of the circuits of capital. Not literally withdraws, of course, but a sort of an erection, or a division is erected which is imminent to capital accumulation into the state. If we go back and we look at the history of the concept of the citizen, right, we'll find that historically only property owners and certain proletarians were historically considered citizens, right? And the formula is used here of male, white, non-white male, right, kind of getting at this. And as this points out, formal legal equality will never be sufficient to free women from the indirectly the IMM sphere of the market-mediated activities because of the way their activities are structurally inscribed within it. And then the next part elaborates on this. This part's called sex and gender. Because the labor of having children is delegated to, quote, women, they enter the labor market characteristically at a disadvantage. Of women as those who, quote, have children is loaded with assumptions regarding, the capacity and regularity of birth, one's commitment to a child once they're born, and so forth. And Gonzalez and Netton point out at this point that Judith Butler would be correct in Gender Trouble, for example, to say that sex is a sort of retroactive biologization of gender. And there's the quote here in the essay where real abstraction is mentioned. So I'd like to just read this quote since I think it's significant to our presentation here. Following this analogy, sex is the material body which, as use value to exchange value, attaches itself to gender. The gender fetish is a social relation which acts upon these bodies so that it appears as a natural characteristic of the bodies themselves. While gender is the abstraction of sexual difference from all of its concrete characteristics, that abstraction transforms and determines the to which it is attached. Just as the real abstraction of value transforms the material body of the commodity. Gender and sex combined give those inscribed within them a natural semblance with the phantom-like objectivity, as if the social content of gender was written upon the skin of the concrete individuals. So we see a certain parallel here that exists with, not that Sohn-Rethel's account is wholly adequate, but Sohn-Rethel's account of second nature, right? And furthermore, the idea here that, and Marx says this at various points, he says that, you have to understand that exchange value and use value are necessarily in a relation, right? So it's the emergence of capitalism which permits us to imagine that there's a sort of qualitative entity which lies immediately beyond, the abstraction of exchange, right? So we can see the same thing with the relationship between gender and sex, right? Having, with the postulate of gender existing, we are compelled to imagine that there's some sort of biological basis which sustains it. Right? And then we have the sort of obligatory comment at the end here about how communization has to abolish both sex and gender at the end of section 4. Section 5 is called the history of gender within capitalism. One of the ironies of capitalism's progression is that as capitalism carries forth the natural aspect of gender, because of new technologies and so forth, becomes increasingly superfluous, even as the lessened cost of the labor power of women remains essential. So to be clear about this, right, and this is very important to stress, when women enter the labor market, this is very, very important here, their labor power is treated as of less value because they're women, because employers know, for example, that typically women are the ones charged with social reproduction, right? So there's actually a very, I think, correct point made. Imagine an employer who's just saying, oh, I want to hire the person who's going to be the most available 24/7, right? Who's going to be the most responsive all the time. In that sort of context, gender inequality is going to assert itself aggressively, right? In spite of the ostensibly neutral attributes which the employer is searching for, right? So again, contra Butler's analysis, right, according to which, she looks at sex and gender as sort of discursively constructed. The matrix of this for Gonzalez and Netton has to do with the comparatively lower value of the labor power of women, right? So the history of gender within capitalism. So the natural aspect of gender becomes increasingly superfluous as capitalism progresses, but at the same time, the structural necessity of indirectly market mediated activities and the association with gender becomes even more emphatic. So we can see that there's a sort of contradiction which emerges at that point. The indirectly market mediated sphere, according to this, organized by capital during the period of primitive accumulation. That was when capitalism became capable, or the capitalist class became capable of organizing not just the structure of markets, but the structure of people's lives in relation to those markets, right? The activities which are not directly market mediated. In the 19th century, women began to enter the directly market mediated sphere of wage labor, even as men were often the legal wage owners. Right. So Marx, for example, compares this to a sort of slavery, right, where men will sort of, send out their daughters and wives to work, but they'll be the ones who claim control over the wage at the end of the day. In the late 19th century, the state restricted women and children's employment, which led to the foundation of the nuclear family, right? So it was and we see in the late 19th century, like Bismarck with Medicare, right? It was the stepping of the state into these relations that allowed for the idea of the nuclear family to be forged. This reached a sort of climax in the Fordist era, where technological innovations, right? You can think of the laundry machine, for example, there are many, permitted women to actually work at home atomically. So if you go before that, often families kind of live together, right? Indirectly market mediated activities were performed more collectively. It was technological developments which allowed the atomization of this. But while many indirectly market mediated activities have become cheaper due to these sort of developments, childcare in of itself is very hard to simply automate away. And the natural result of this is that indirectly market-mediated activities pertaining to childcare tend to be passed on to the poorest strata of the population, right? So we all know this sort of example, right, of the wealthy family in California, you know, double income, and they pay, you know, someone from Mexico who may or may not be legal, right, a woman to take care of their kids, right? And, you know, at the end of, very important point at the end of you know, the fifth section, capitalism for its very function must have an exteriority, or a kind of what they call an object, right? You know, in order for it to function. The question only becomes who is going to be responsible, right, for the for taking care of that. And the final section deals a little bit more with, now remember that this essay was, first of all, that this, one second, this essay was published in, and I believe, was this 2013, I think. And the full title is On the Separation of Spheres and the Process of Objection. So the final section deals more with the theme of objection. And this is being written in the wake of the 2008 crisis. But I think this final section is specifically responsive to some of the actions undertaken, because remember, EndNotes is partly out of London or England. I think this final section is particularly responsive to proposals such as David Cameron's Big Society, right? According to which, you know, there was going to be an increase in mission of the extent of the engagement in these activities by the state, and an augmentation of the role played by volunteers in private communities, right? So this part starts out to reduce debt to GDP ratios post-crisis. States are now cutting state-organized indirectly market-mediated services. So again, we talked about the example of to work at a daycare, for example. States are cutting back on those things in order to save money after the 2008 and 2010 crisis. This leaves women in the position of having to provide these services themselves. Silvia Federici she's singled out in this for adopting a positive view of women's capacity for resistance within this context, you know, organizing within communities, within the home. But this essay isn't so optimistic about that possibility. And in fact, I think it even goes so far in this essay to say, Federici says, I think at one point, many may see this as a fate worse than death. And the authors respond, yes, indeed, this would be worse than death, right? To have to take these things on and to have the state to sort of totally withdraw from this, right? There's a bit of a conflation of Federici's position with some of the processes of privatization going on, which is maybe a little bit unfair, but I do get the point. Then there's a bit of a technical clarification of the idea of objection, the idea of the object. The object, according to this, refers specifically to previous indirectly market-mediated activities that the state has been organizing or has been responsible for providing wages for, that they have now relinquished, right? So it refers to that process of withdrawal. I'm not sure if the usage of the term within the essay itself is totally consistent with that, but important anyway. And the essay concludes by saying the denaturalization of sex has now allowed us to see gender as a kind of external constraint, right? The denaturalization of sex makes gender visible, right, in a way. And I want to just read the final paragraph, because I think it's suggestive for our discussion and also resists summary in a sense. A last thought to conclude. If it happens to be true that the present moment allows us to see both our class belonging and our gender belonging as external constraints, this cannot be accidental, or can it? This question is critical for an understanding of the struggle which leads to the abolition of gender, that is, to the reproduction by non-gendered individuals of a life in which all separate spheres of activity have been abolished. So saying there that we see not only at this specific moment, class as an external constraint, but also gender as an external constraint. I'm not maybe so persuaded that we do see class as an external constraint at this present moment, but I think that's also something worth discussing. So is that good? Does everyone kind of, is it clear what the essay is about? Yeah, okay. So I just want to say three things very, very briefly, because I want to get on to Jala. Just the first point I want to bring up, I don't think it's broadly incorrect to say that, what we keep say social production or what more perhaps scientifically Gonzalez and Netton call unwaged IMM activities, that this is a sort of blind spot for Marx. I think that is clear. But with regards to the quote that's provided, it really, I think if you look at some parts of Marx, you can see that, and Engels as well, right? You can see that there are different tendencies. So I just want to quote here from chapter 15 of Capital. Marx writes, since certain family functions, such as nursing and suckling children, cannot be entirely suppressed, the mothers who have been confiscated by capital must try substitutes of some sort. Domestic work, such as sewing and mending, must be replaced by the purchase of ready-made articles. Hence the diminished expenditure of labor housed by an increased expenditure of money outside. The cost of production of the working class therefore increases and balances its greater income. In addition to this, economy and judgment in the consumption and preparation of the means of subsistence becomes impossible. So a sort of recognition there that I think is quite a bit more conscious than the quote that this essay provides. But there's also another point, states, hence the sum of the means of subsistence necessary for the production of labor power must include the means necessary for the labor's substitutes, i.e. its children, in order that this race of peculiar commodity owners may perpetuate its appearance in the market, which maybe gets us halfway there anyway. But still, focusing too narrowly on the idea of means of subsistence. I think that's clear. So I just, I'm not even really criticizing the essay on that point. I just want to point out that you can take different quotes from Marx. And obviously, if we look at something like Engels, right, the origin of family private property in the state, we see a very different picture emerging, right? Now, there are lots of problems with Engels' account in that text. He seems to, essentialize this difference between, IMM and DMM, even to the point of situating it as having emerged thousands of years ago, which I think is basically wrong. But there are, I think, very, very compelling aspects of Engels' account. And certainly he does, the centrality of reproduction, right, biological reproduction for the perpetuation of human societies, very, very clearly in that text. I want to make just two other very quick points. The first point in this, I understand what the goal of this piece, what this piece is trying to do, right, which is to analyze how gender qua sex emerges within the context of capitalism and to keep the focus on the capitalist mode of production. I certainly understand that. I think part of the difficulty with this sort of analytic from the standpoint of that mode of production specifically is that, in a way, when they say things like, well, gender is emergent, through capitalism and this kind of thing, someone might say, well, isn't the case that the reforms of division which presage that, right? This didn't just, start with the capitalist mode of production. So there's actually another piece that Maya wrote called Communization and the Abolition of Gender online. There's about 3 pieces by Maya online. I've read them all. In that one, she actually attributes, if I'm not mistaken, she attributes the beginning of gender to actually what is described as the beginnings of class society. So I think that's very interesting, and I think maybe while one has to certainly set the way that, like we were talking about, the more developed concrete and the less developed concrete before, one certainly has to separate the functioning of gender under capitalism from its earlier functioning, as well as to talk about the way that there's this biologization in the form of sex. I do think that, prior to when the capitalist mode of production emerges, you can see the way that, these sort of binary or sort of the segregation of women into a domain in which social reproduction becomes significant, even presages that, right? And there are different ways to analyze that from the standpoint of ancient history as well, right? But again, we have to be very careful about how we use these terms, not to over or under generalize them. The third point I'm going to make, okay, maybe it's a little bit non sequitur. The third point I'm going to make is, I know yesterday when Jason was talking, he was, and I kind of like more because he just, very, very expansive kind of analysis. But when Jason was talking, he was saying these things like, well, we have to look at the resistance of the femitarian area, right? And I think what's interesting, really interesting about Jason's analysis is influenced as well by certain movements, speculative realism, Latour, and so forth, but also very much, of course, through abstraction and eco-socialism. What Jason has been trying to do is actually sort of move the goalposts, right, in terms of how we, conceive of the appropriation of use values and associated agency beyond the realm of the human, certainly, right? So of course we can say, women, well, yes, not just women, of course, but there are many women who perform indirectly market-mediated activities, which are essential to the perpetuation of capitalism, but aren't direct. But of course, Jason's point would be, when we appropriate things freely from nature, right? That's also part of that same process. It's use value appropriation, right? Which is essential to exchange value exploitation, right? So, when you talk about, and I thought it was very interesting when he said, the biotary can resist in a certain way, not in terms of agency as we conceive of it, but it shows in certain respects its unwillingness to accommodate, this very linear capitalist agenda, right? I think what we have to really take into consideration is that the idea of the human, as we think about it, is also shaped by the performance of wage labor, right? And we have to question, I think, even the reflexive assumption that, when we talk about capitalism and the way it functions, that has to be a discussion about human actors, right? No, I don't want to get to, into really cheesy panpsychism or something, but I hope that my point is taken in that respect. So that's all I have to say. And now I'll move on to Jala, and she can go.
Oh, I'm not muted. Yeah, okay. So I spend a lot of time with this text. I read it a lot with students, probably annually. I assign it a lot because it's very functional and very efficient. It does a lot in very few pages. But for all that, until I had reread it for this conference, that I noticed something really interesting, which is that although the co-authors never cite Sohn-Rethel, his work is kind of invisibly the armature and the framework for the argument. And that is, I think, and the argument is that gender is a function of the market, whether it's directly market mediated or indirectly market mediated, and those two terms are mutually constitutive. But in any case, I find the apex of the argument, which is taking place on page 81 of the hard copy, and it's during the sort of apogee of their getting at the point, which is the most Sohn-Rethelian. So I'm just going to read a couple of sentences. So, quote, "In this sense, the transformation of the condition of gender relations goes on behind of those whom it defines." And in this sense, gender is constantly reimposed and renaturalized. So that I think after these 3 days, that language is very recognizable and has its own particular texture and tenor. And the other crucial statement on the same page, quote, what the female signifies, that which is socially inscribed upon naturalized sexuated bodies, is not only an array of, quote, feminine or gendered characteristics, but essentially a price tag. So that returns to how the whole matrix of this argument has to do with a set of market relations, which would probably open up the debates that happened after the first session today, which is the way in which it's holding in tension this kind of notion of market-derived, artificially second-natured identity. And on the other hand, all of the conversations about socially necessary labor time and value as originating in that socially necessary labor time, which brings me to what I think is the ultimate use value of this essay, which is that it answers a kind of overarching contradiction in our present, which is why do women continue to be paid, for instance, at 71 cents for every dollar a man is paid, when we all know that in the kind of very uneven and very recent passage from feudalism to modernity, which women have come through only recently, as they mention. So, quote, they have only quite recently become the owners of their labor power with double freedom. And that double freedom is, of course, the freedom from serfdom to sell their labor power, and the fact that they're free of any other commodity to peddle. But anyway, in that very belated and recent passage from gendered feudalism to modernity, the question remains, why, when we all know that women continue to be strapped with the burden of childcare much more than men do, why are they paid so much less? And so that what they call an apparent contradiction is addressed, quote, as an apparent contradiction, once sexual difference becomes structurally defined and reproduced, women as a bearer of labor power with a higher social cost becomes its opposite, the commodity labor power with a cheaper price. The higher social cost, I'm interpreting that to mean the kind of burden of childcare and the multiple bodies that have to be reproduced daily, even though that labor power is purchased more cheaply. And their explanation for that, and Conrad, I think your summary was great. The only slight difference I might have, so I don't think that they're necessarily making the assumption that, you know, all women can or may reproduce or bear children or whatever. The problem goes back to the discussion in the previous session, which is about metrics and math. It's because the assumption isn't that every woman bears children. It's that because any one woman could or might possibly exit direct market mediation to take the time to bear and raise children, all women, the sort of mass totality of women have to pay the price for any one individual woman who chooses to have children, because it gets recalculated into socially necessary labor time. It's again, this kind of larger calculus that explains the cheapening of women's labor, even though they're quote unquote more socially expensive. So I think that's really the ultimate, the most compelling takeaway of this essay is its explanation for what we see everywhere, the contradiction between those who need and those who are paid. So it's kind of diametrically opposed to the whole Marxian from those according to their capacity to those according to their need. Women contradict that a priori, if you like. So that's really all I need to add to your summary. My final point, as my own take or gloss, is that I'm not sure in the final instant if this essay is really about the abolition of gender per se, so much as the abolition of women, if gender equality is to occur. So, you know, it's a very rigorous and careful dismantling of the category of women. But I don't think that begins to address gender more broadly, or the genders. And I think I would second your question about whether or not class is an external constraint by asking about the degree to which gender or women, the category woman, is an external constraint. The way that is argued in this essay, through this kind of Sohn-Rethelian framework, and how the market becomes a matrix for direct and indirect market mediation, would suggest that the category woman is an external constraint, and we can kind of get past it. But just as a thought experiment to kind of work to approach this essay through, you know, the kind of like a negative proof in math or something, you know, if we were all to evolve past the possession of a uterus, say the next virus that comes along allows us to mutate past that, I'm not sure that constraint would sort of automatically slip away because of the historical concatenation and baggage of gender through time. So I suspect that another trait or characteristic would immediately come in to substitute for the problem of the responsibility for children. I'm not sure that we can do away with the category woman as much as we might like to, by seeing it only as an external constraint because of the way in which it has been introjected for so long. And I'm using the term introjection the way it was used in the previous session, which is as something artificial that then mutates and takes on its own life in the development of every subsequent category. And that's my only concern. Thanks.
Okay, Paul.
Okay, I hope I will make 4 short points to contribute to this discussion. Taking a lead from the endnotes piece, Logic Agenda, I'm sympathetic to a systematic dialectics that juxtaposes levels of abstraction critically against each other and the concrete experience of subjects gendered by the attitudes of capitalist heteropatriarchy. I agree to an extent that we should understand gender categories as real abstractions inscribed on subjects in capitalist societies, whether the subjects are people, organizations, networks, or structures. Though I think, contrary to the article, that spatiality and temporality are important in ensuring the concrete level is always already represented in analysis. This is not to say that the concept of gender, or indeed some of its lived characteristics, are only articulated in and through capitalism, but it is to claim that the particular articulations under a global capitalist project in the late 20th and early 21st century does make much of the experience of gender inextricably entwined with the experience of capitalism. Much of the rest of Gonzalez's text is exploring the situatedness of gender in binary characteristics, reproduction, production, labor time, and the reproduction of labor power, paid and unpaid labor, directly and indirectly market mediated spheres, public and private spheres, blind markets and dual labor markets, and sex and gender as a binary. In this latter, Gonzalez and Netten trace the decoupling of sex and gender, denaturalization, and the historical movement from the development of indirect market mediated spheres to a more commodified gendered system under capitalism. They thus produce A schema read the history of gender relations and capitalism through shifts in the application and balances of these binaries. This is taken from primitive accumulation and extended family to nuclear family under Fordism, to real subsumption and commodification from the 1970s, to abjection under contemporary crises and austerity. This provides a schematic understanding of gender relations under capitalism that combines Marxist with feminist concerns, and which recognises the centrality of the commodity form, both in labour and exchange value and differential experiences of economic activity as gender. These binary categories are abstractions that enable persuasive analysis, but they also represent real concrete distinctions in everyday practice, social organisation, cultural representations and economic activity. The schematisation of the historical development of gender under capitalism can be disputed, either as a general historical survey and periodization, or in the minutiae of each stage it describes through more detailed composition of how these abstractions characterise concrete everyday life. The architecture of the analysis as presented, however, that abstraction allows us to identify central factors in understanding the logic of gender as lived experience, and that abstraction is not simply tested alternative conceptual articulations, but in the forge of everyday activity, is more a question not of gender, but of the relationship between abstraction as method and abstraction as subject and meaning in the world. Undoubtedly, feminist theoretical constructs have elucidated the gendered nature of capitalist societies, most notably through variants of patriarchal critique. Yet to simply see them as conceptual analysis is to miss the instantiation of these categories. For example, what is private and public, or domestic and work, that shaped people's life trajectories and experiences, and the social and cultural organisation of political economy. So I'm trying to talk about both the concrete everyday experience of people's lives as being touched, shaped, possibly determined by these categories. To understand these categories is to understand them as real active attributes that have direct impacts upon how people reflect on their place in the world and how they conceive of and characterize their actions to self and. This is a terrain of ideology and hegemony as means of life trajectories being shaped and determined at different points in different ways, in different contexts and conjunctures within prevailing status quo. What is important in this insight is to understand that the danger of articulating abstraction is that it is abstracting itself. Discourse is conceptually constructed, and all human activity has to be communicated through linguistic symbolic representations and articulations within the framework of cultural contexts and conjunctures that condition that discourse. This leads to three concerns. The first is that the danger of this sort of schematized exploration of gender through binaries is not qualified by the momentary, temporally limited nature of these binaries at their edges. It is not that these edges are the most important focus for discussion and activity, but that there is a recognition that conceptual schemas and hierarchies should always be more conditional and rough-edged than is sometimes presented. This does not diminish either the critical power or impact of these conceptions as real abstractions, but to recognize that real abstractions are constituted in a complex and messy world. Its main impact is to caution the intellectual as to the reach, strength, and particularly finality of their claims. Second, the ahistorical categories of these binaries, even schematized into historical periodization, always have to be understood as appearing in the world in myriad forms, in myriad cultural articulations that can expose the difference with which people might understand, for example, private-public within local or global contexts or conjunctures, in cultures and subcultures, in spatial locations within different nations, localities and how they are traversed, in particular legal systems and so on. Real abstraction has to recognize the spaces of diversity within every category because how it is lived is variable. Finally, abstraction in the obverse should not be reduced to become the always unsatisfactory and limited exercise of claims of empirical veracity. This discussion is the operation of real abstraction as a dialectical process in which the subject is always simultaneously present and negated, contradictions and tensions exposed, critical and open-ended. The power and persistence of these categories and the extent of the sum of deployments and articulations are recognized for their utility and resilience. And that underlines their persuasiveness as explandum and as categories for which political interventions might be made, whether to extrapolate phenomena as insightful or critically deconstruct as oppressive, exploitative, and alienating. The caution is that when the categories become universalized without provisionality or recognition of their genealogy, their evolution in context and conjuncture, they become articles of orthodox that redraw hierarchies and negate the abstractive dialectic with the life world that real abstraction brings. Finally, I want to address the issue. This sort of discussion of real abstraction adds in value to discussions of gender. Modern feminist critiques since the 1960s, following trajectories of liberal, radical, Marxist, socialist, black, third world, and lesbian, had two impetus. The first was to describe the terms of gender inequality, power, and domination within modern capitalism, or capitalist patriarchy, from which sharp debates in gender or class in capitalism dominated the 1970s and 1980s. Hartman's Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism comes to mind. The second was the failure of modern feminisms to situate themselves within diverse women's experiences and what are now framed as intersections with race, sexuality, disability, and spatial cultures globally, particularly the global south. This evolution of feminism with progressively sensitive conceptions such as feminist standpoint theory, simultaneously embedded in the development of an appreciation of diverse women's lives, experiences, and engagements with the world, and critical to the formation of identity-based political engagements and analyses by which these variants form their own standpoint to represent the richness of women's experience, oppression, but also achievements and struggles. With queer critiques, transgender critiques, and critiques of masculinity, we see a broadening of gender on, but not necessarily against, a feminist gender-oriented critique. There is even the current controversy over feminists who are unsympathetic to trans women as women, which seems a negation of the direction within which feminism has tried to develop a progressive coalition against gender oppressions and hierarchical demarcations, and for the appreciation of diversity and respect for gender identities, which analytically organized, socially constituted, and self-appellated. Social reproduction is relevant here so far as its characterization as a theory is somewhat misleading. It is more a paradigm where categorical balances of binaries and diverse real experiences of gendered subjects can be explored, with crucial questionings of both these categories and binaries as organizing principles and how they are manifest as real gendered impositions, concrete processes, and activities. Most evidently, it challenges the way in which these binaries have previously been hierarchies, such as commodity production against social reproduction. One does not have to embrace particular articulations of social reproduction to recognize the value of a space that explicitly encourages constructive critical debate on the logics of gender, understood as diverse, plural, plastic, and embodied. Real abstraction acts as clarification of method and in ontology, discipline to analysis, and recognitions of abstraction's dialectic with the lived world. I'm sorry if that sounded rather strenuous. I'm not somebody who normally reads papers. I normally just extrapolate, but hopefully you got something from it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paul. So should we open up if anyone, I don't know if maybe some people read this, or should we open it up maybe to the audience to provide their feedback, and then we can kind of generate a discussion? Okay, so if anyone, if they want to write their questions or put their hands up, or just make a comment, because you don't have to necessarily ask a question. Okay, we have Richard Seaford here.
This isn't a contribution, but just a very basic question, the answer to which would be helpful for people like me. I should know the answer to this, but I'm afraid I just don't. Clearly here, when we call gender a real abstraction, we're operating with a conception of real abstraction, which is different from and broader than that used by Sohn-Rethel. What is that definition? What is it that makes an abstraction a real abstraction? Is it some kind of ontological privilege? Is it social consequentiality? What is it? So it's really helpful to have a precise definition of what we're talking about. It's helpful in all sorts of ways. It's not just a definitional issue. But then there's a second question that arises from that. I noticed that Conrad said that Butler was claiming that there was an analogy between exchange value and gender. Gender in relation to sex, exchange value in relation to
sorry, I claim that Gonzalez and Netton were talking about in the essay. Yeah.
Okay, so it's the analogy is of exchange value with gender and use value with sex. Okay. Now, this then raises the question, is it an analogy or is it something more than an analogy? I mean, which is another way of putting the question would be, is there a relationship between Sohn-Rethel real abstraction, which originates in or is implicit in commodity exchange, and real abstraction in the broad sense? Is it just an analogy or is there something more than that? Is the Sohn-Rethel phenomenon, which goes back thousands of years, a precondition for what is called real abstraction in this very broad and for me rather undefined as yet sense?
I guess I guess I can respond to that, and then we can. Do we want to take? Should we take more than one? Okay, Howard, why don't you ask, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, well, I can respond to that. Drawing on the contemporary philosophy of science, particularly scientific realism, scientific realism grounds the world in the idea of causal structures or relations. To be is just to be able to do. And so it's very important. This hasn't been present in the discussion so far, needs to be. And that is, number one, we refer to abstraction in two different ways. One is that it's conceptual. The other is that it's non-empirical. And there's an ambiguity there. In other words, if it's conceptual, then what you get is something that Richard Boyd at Cornell, a philosopher of science, calls medically innocent. It doesn't of itself do anything, right? Whereas the non-empirically real is causally potent. And so, for example, gravity is, we don't touch it, we don't taste it, we don't see it, but it is certainly causally potent and we track it in its effects. Same for a photon. And so social relations are like, Marx says at a certain point that you can only access relations by means of ideas, right? But that doesn't reduce them to ideas. In other words, social relations are causally potent. And so a real abstraction is the non-empirical that is causally potent.
Okay, I'll get back to an answer, I think, the other part of Richard's question in a minute, but does anyone else have anything they'd like to say at this point? Or any of our panelists, if they want to add something further? No, okay. Well, then what I'm going to say, just to add, so about this question of what real abstraction is, I mean, I would agree that with Howard's definition and what he's saying, though I think this can lead to certain confusions. And I'm thinking of a debate which occurred, not really a debate, it was a response made on the blog Charnel House. And in that context, they were criticizing Bono in his book on fanaticism, right? Because he says that religion is a real abstraction, right? So if we use sort of, the definition supplied by Howard, you can see why that makes sense, right? Because this is something that performs a certain role within society, right? That can be conceived of in relation to the market and so forth. Though how much you'd want to reduce it to that in pre-capitalist context is another question, but it can be construed in that way. But at the same time, there's a sort of fetish function, right, which is posited as something which is, kind of mystifying and totalizing, right, in that respect. So, but no, I do recognize, and what the blog post takes issue with is the fact that, again, for Sohn-Rethel, real abstraction is commodity exchange, right? That's what it is. But Sohn-Rethel does use other language, right, to talk about, other forms of abstraction. So I don't have all of that at my disposal right now, but one thing he talks about, for example, are ideal abstractions of which real abstraction is productive of, right? So I think that, I don't think that we have an exact language for this. I think the tendency has just been to because this is a pretty new thing, right? Like, I think that, I could be wrong, but I think that other than maybe briefly in the 70s, I think that real abstraction has only progressed to being, a sort of framework for research in the past decade and a half or so. I think the tendency has just been to adapt the term real abstraction in a rather loose way in terms of how it's applied. But that might take us a little bit away from the core question of gender as well, which we should keep in mind. Does anyone else? Is there anyone else who has a question? Okay, sure. Continue.
As far as your last remark is, we do want to focus on real abstraction. There are a million discussions of gender everywhere. And the specific point of this conference is real abstraction. And its relationship with gender is really interesting, makes it both specific and interesting. So I'm not happy about, as it were, getting back from real abstraction to gender. We need to think about both. But Howard has got us some of the way, because at least he's provided a definition. And gravity would be an example then of a real abstraction. So would energy and a whole number of other things, because they're clearly causally potent, and yet they're abstract. Now, the trouble about that is, is gender, therefore, according to Howard's definition, a real abstraction? Well, it all depends on the sense in which it's causally potent. The language of gender has enormous consequences, as enormous social consequences. But at the same time, it's metaphysically something quite distinct from energy or gravity or the kind of things that Howard's definition produces. So I don't want to get lost in this question of definition, so we can abandon it now if you like. However, I do think that the discipline of the discussion, the productivity of the discussion, is enormously improved if we actually do share a specific conception, because abstraction is almost, as Aristotle said, almost the same thing as cognition. Cognition, in almost all of it, involves abstraction. Almost all language involves abstraction. We'd hardly be dealing with a broader category. If you then simply add the word real to it, what are you doing? Does that vagueness remain, or can we make it much more productive by coming to some sort of definition of it? But I'm not going to press the point, but I just leave that reflection as a guide to increasing the productivity of our discussion.
Okay. Does anyone have any? Okay, I can, because Howard, you'd like to. I can go. Does anyone have anyone else?
Yeah.
I just want to say, does anyone else have anything to add? Sure. Yeah.
I was going to add something, but you can wait for
sure. Okay, Howard, go then, and then Paul will.
Okay. The question, if I could just add more in terms of the scientific realism, the search then is for real definition. And so H2O, for example, is an example of a real definition of something we're all very familiar with. So the question then is, can we do that with social relations? And that's what I did in my book with Bettelheim's double separation, was to show a real definition of capital. And so the question then with respect to gender and race is, can we provide a real definition of gender and of race? And I'm not sufficiently familiar with the literature on gender to know if there have been movements in that direction, but that's what needs to be done. In other words, to come up with the situative elements that track for us the way the social relation of gender, structures our daily life, as Paul referred to. And for example, going back to the question of a witch, right? How is that constructed socially and so forth? Yeah.
Okay, Paul, you can.
I just wanted to ruminate a little on Richard's question, which is a good question. When I first began to think about this 4-day exercise, I read Sohn-Rethel again. I think there is much in it to be valued, and we should keep much of it in mind. But to my mind, concepts grow and develop from their use. So if we look at Marx, we look at any philosopher, they'll argue over exactly what they meant by a concept, but equally the concepts as they grow in debate are in use. Now, Sohn-Rethel doesn't, as far as I can see, really address certain issues such as gender, and therefore we have to. And that may mean that the concept itself begins.
Gender, genau.
1 second.
Das ist nur hier.
Andreas Harms is. Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, I think I can carry on.
Okay.
In which case, I think what we're talking about is the development of a concept. Now, I think it's very important for us to acknowledge how we describe the evolution of that concept, both in terms of its application to the analysis of the world and as people who operate that concept in a critical way. I'm not entirely sure I'm worried that we are stretching Sohn-Rethel, and I still think there is Sohn-Rethel in all the presentations. But I think it's legitimate to say real abstraction can be more than Sohn-Rethel's original representation. I mean, it seems to me what I would stress is that the process of abstraction is part of cognition, the process of abstraction is part of developing an analysis, but it's when you take that back into the concrete and you recognize that both discipline of your analysis and the strength of that concept in the world as gender, as shaping people's lives, that to me is the essence of real abstraction. But I will try to actually develop a more lucid.
Was real Abstraktion mit Gender zu
Can we
tun hat.
mute Andreas Harms? Good. Okay, good. Okay, Paul, are you done then? Okay, Luca Brennecke, you want to say something?
Yeah. Hi. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Cool. No, I was just I read the text very carefully, and I think that so the perspective from which I'm reading it is, believe it or not, I recently started to read a little bit of Immanuel Kant, and I found a very interesting sentence there, and it's reason is the birthplace of categories, and I think that this is important for the following reason. If we think of the notion of conception, right, which refers both to the process of conceiving a child, but also to conceptualizing something, I think that it's just an interesting turn of words, which allows us to imagine Kant as this brood mother of rationality, and this is interesting because it really challenged for me. Like, this is a way to challenge, like literally how we understand things as reproduction and conception, and the sort of the gestation or the of subjects. Yes, that's it.
Okay, yeah, I think that's very helpful as well. Is there anyone now who would like to say something? Okay, I can add something very quickly about this question of what real abstraction is. I mean, I think that Paul talked about turning back to the concrete, and I want to just add very quickly that I think that it's not just turning back to the concrete in the generic sense, but also turning back to the concrete in a way which relates the basis of the concept in either those processes, which are, part of capitalism, and we could talk about these sort of constituent categories, money, property, labor power, and so forth, or in a pre-capitalist context, what Marx referred to, as I said, the less developed concrete. So those aspects of capitalism which are latent in pre-capitalist societies. That's the way I describe it. So for example, when Alberto Toscano, when he says, well, religion is a real abstraction, he talks about the way that Marx often, sometimes more literally, talks about the relationship between the Catholic Church and, for example, the operation of commodity markets in the Roman context, or these kind of things, right? So I think that, of course we can say that, well, if, the notion of substance, which is permanent in time, is connected to, the exchange abstraction and so forth, this could theoretically be applied to anything. To look at what we're doing when we use the word real abstraction, right? Because so many things could potentially fall under that nexus, as Richard correctly points out, that I think that, the specificity of the designation becomes very, very central to the usage of the word. But I do hope that we'll be able to shift, to talking more as well about gender specifically as well. Are there other, Richard, you'd like to say something?
Relief response to that. I mean, this whole question of Alberto Toscano claiming that religion is a real abstraction. The obvious objection to that from a Sohn-Rethel perspective is that religion has been around for tens of thousands of years, and commodity exchange is a much more recent phenomenon. But nevertheless, there's a further point you can add there, and this also applies to gender, which is that it'd be difficult to find religion in the modern world that was not influenced by real abstraction in the narrow Sohn-Rethel. So what we have is a whole research program, as it were, in which we look at crucial abstractions, and including gender and religion and so on, and we don't just say, well, they're socially consequential, they're important, they're embodied in the concrete, they re-enter the concrete, and so on. Those aren't quite the best questions. What we ask is, what is a historical relation, and that's history right up to the present moment, what is a historical relation between real abstraction in the Sohn-Rethel sense and the power of these abstractions, right? The religion provides you a paradigm. That religious conceptions are profoundly influenced by notions of abstract value and abstract substance, but they also consist of an awful lot more. And the same can no doubt be said of other key abstractions, presumably gender included. So that's a whole research program. It's a whole way of thinking in which we extend the importance of real abstraction in the Sohn-Rethel sense to all those other things that we're inclined to call real abstraction, but are clearly not real abstraction in the Sohn-Rethel sense.
Sure, and I think, by the way, when Toscano uses that, he cites Marx referring to Christianity as like the religion of the commodity par excellence. So Marx, I think in Capital, Marx, not just in relationship to the development of capitalism, but also in terms of, Marx appears to draw a connection between the development of commodity markets and monotheism.
That's
right.
Protestantism. So I mean, Marx is talking about a very specific form of religion, not religion as a whole, which of course he would say nothing of the kind about religion as a whole.
Not religion as a whole, but monotheism and more than Protestantism. Actually, he says that, he talks about Judaism having developed in terms of the way that Jews were connected to commerce. He talks about in the inner mundi of the ancient world.
No, but on that page, on that very page, where he talks into mundi, he talks about Christianity. He says Christianity is the ideal religion for commodity production, and more specifically, he says Protestantism. So he does set, but nevertheless, so no, it's a very specific form of religion he's talking about.
We can continue that, but I want to move to I think I'm going to say Professor Mansour from now on, but you can talk if you like.
Yeah, I just want to return to the logic of endnotes for a minute. Again, I'm blown away by the way in which this essay proceeds along Sohn-Rethelian terms without ever citing Sohn-Rethel, and in that way it kind of performs what it's talking about and what it's doing. So the reason that gender for endnotes is a real abstraction, whereas gravity is not a real abstraction, or religion is not a real abstraction, is the same way that the Duchampian ready-made is a real abstraction, whereas something made by Pollock or Kandinsky or anyone else is just abstraction. It's not a real abstraction. And again, the reason for that is the originary matrix of the market, right? It's this problem of the money form, kind of double condition, and that bizarre metaphysic that it introduces that distinguishes real abstractions from abstractions. And that, I think, is really the gist and the crux of this article, is that women are women because they're bought cheap. Their time is cheap. Their time, their experiential time, is not valued in the same way that other subject positions' experiential time is valued. And it's the centrality of that market mediation that I think distinguishes abstraction from real abstraction and brings it back to why Sohn-Rethel, whether he's cited or not, is the backbone. So, you know, I'm responding to Richard Seaford's very important prompt that, you know, this is a conference about Sohn-Rethel. What are the specific tools that Sohn-Rethel affords us to think about these various things? Can't just be collapsed back into abstraction. I think that's, I would hang on to that as the kind of most important element. Women are women because the market defines them as such. And this brings me back to actually Conrad's paper at HM in 2018, where distinction, I don't want to butcher what you said in 2018, Conrad, but the distinction between animals and women, you know, they were both put in this larger category of chattel. Mm-hmm. And then what distinguishes women from animals, what anthropomorphizes them, is a kind of relation to the encroachment of the marketization of their existence in the world. So in that regard, I think what you were getting at there along Sohn-Rethel's terms is the category of woman is born with agriculture and markets. So without, you know, getting too impassioned or too far afield, I think what this essay on gender gives us is the key distinction between abstraction and real abstraction. Although the heuristic for me, because I think art is making thinking, is still, you know, the Duchampian ready-made, because all the constituent components derive from the market, not from the creativity of the artist in his or her studio. So that's still for me the mast I'm going to cling to. But I think the authors are saying something similar about this otherwise naturalized category that might not exist if it were not for these forms of market mediation.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the reference to my 2018 paper at HM. Fond memories for me because that's where I met Paul and Professor Mansour at the same time. But what I want to say, yeah, so I guess this gets us back to the question of what is, you know, and I think this is very important, like how does, because you're talking about commodity markets, obviously in a pre-capitalist sense, right? How can we conceive of the emergence of this binarization that later manifests in a specific way under capitalism? I think I have a certain theory of this, right? And not that I don't claim to have developed it, you know, individually or anything, but the way I see this would be that I think that, you know, it's very interesting even in Italy. I'm in Rome now. If you go down to Naples, what you'll find is that there's a category of people called feminelli, and they don't really fit into like a binary gender system. I guess, you know, maybe the way we would characterize this in terms of our normal lexicon is like cross-dressers. But they're not really recognized as either or in terms of men or women. And it's interesting, right? Because, you know, this is what Sohn-Rethel remarked when he spent time in Naples, right? He said, in so many respects, Naples in the 20s still resembles like the 17th century, right, or an earlier period. I think the question here becomes, you have to separate out in a way two things. And I think on one side you have the organization of the reproduction of, I risk being anachronistic here, but labors, right? For the production of raw materials or surplus product for the perpetuation of a society. And on the other hand, the specific division within capitalism whereby labor becomes waged. Well, what happens when labor becomes waged, right? What happens is it makes the wage, right? If you look in earlier societies, you had people who were married, right? And it wasn't like, the man was going to work and he was the one who had the power of the wage, that he could take it away, right? You had people, in these sort of more collective situations, and so on. So I think that what we have to understand is that there can be a binarization, which is already sort of imminent, right? Or already manifested in these pre-capitalist formations that has to do with the need to organize, say, like the reproduction of labors avant la lettre, if you will. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that the division is going to be as strict as it will subsequently become. And I think it's very, very interesting in that respect, that if we look at the emergence of capitalism, right, what we see, in tandem with race and so forth, is the attempt to take, I think, this category of gender, which, is already latent or manifest in some sense, and to transmute it into a biological category. And I understand that that starts to happen heavily, I think, around the 15th or 16th century. So around the same time that we're seeing Africans, for example, right? And I think, I don't know, someone could give me the name, but I forget. There was a Portuguese writer in the 15th century who was the first one to produce a treatise in which there was a biological essentialization of Africans as inferior, Africans, people from everyone from Africa. And this was actually done, it was paid for by the Portuguese monarch at the time. It was actually commissioned by him, in order to justify the slave trade, right, that they'd established. So I think that you have to look at the way that we can't assume that these divisions just suddenly emerge within capitalism, but we also have to look at how they become more rigid for different reasons, or biologistic within a capitalist context. So that's what I would add to that. Are there other, does anyone jump in right now? Anyone? I think too, I'll just add too, I think there's an issue there that we have to address about Engels and the origin of family, private property in the state. To me, one of the, great classics of Marxist work, and I think sometimes there's an unfortunate tendency to dismiss it or to claim that Marx wasn't on board with this sort of research. It's very unfortunate, of course, in anthropology, right? Because we had this famous thesis by Louis Henry Morgan that Marx and Engels attached themselves to, according to which, let's say, societies which weren't defined by the exchange abstraction in any way, shape, or form, we might even say pre-agrarian societies, were matrilineal as opposed to matriarchal, right? Which was Bakoffen before, right? And I think from about the 1920s on, that thesis was widely discredited by anthropology. And you see all these things, right? Even someone like Margaret Mead in anthropology became such a controversial figure. There's like Derek Freeman spent his whole life just trying to discredit Margaret Mead, you get sensitivities about these issues. But now, actually, it's very funny because I think now there's like, after 80 years of people saying this thesis of primitive matrilineality is totally bunk, now we see like Helen Alvarez at the University of Utah and other people, and they're like, oh, actually, maybe that was right, right? Like, and even Levi Strauss and people like this, they're functioning under the assumption that this earlier anthropological work was totally bunk. But anyway, I just want to bracket that. But I want to say that I think that what is really, really important about the origin of family, private property in the state is that, so for Engels, if I understand properly, following Morgan, he understands the emergence of commodity markets as resulting in the relegation of women to, I guess, what we could term the domain of social reproduction. He doesn't necessarily date the emergence of those commodity markets in a way, but it is interesting from modern standards. But it is interesting. I think he talks about the exchange of livestock, right, as being very, very crucial. I think now anthropologists think it's like the exchange of, Richard might come in and correct me on this, the exchange of tools for agriculture that really gets that going. But I think that even if Engels goes too far in reading the 19th century division of under into ancient society, I think that we have to take this more seriously than we've been taking it, right? You know, and I think that we have to talk about the way that as even a tributary society begins to organize itself, right? You know, when you begin to have plowshare agriculture and things like this, how you know, if you start to think in terms of the reproduction of a society, or the amount of labor that was required, there's actually more labor that was required, you know, even for subsistence. The way that the elevation of the birth rate plays into that, and how that can lead to a sort of de facto separation of spheres long before something like the commodification of labor power. So that's what all I wanted to say. I see Richard wants to come in. You're muted.
Sorry, I can't help responding briefly to the intriguing point about matrilineal. It's what was debunked really was not so much matrilineal as matriarchy, which is different. I mean, matrilineal is simply descent through the female line, female power. And there's a sort of popular myth of matriarchy, which is clearly doesn't correspond to the reality at all. But matrilineal is still there. I mean, there's good evidence that Greek society had been matrilineal, that is in the vocabulary, for example. But what most interesting things about the status of the female in ancient societies is, of course, and this is something that gave fuel to the belief in matriarchy, is that metaphysically, the female is predominant in various phases of ancient society, and if not predominant, at least equal. So that, for example, we now know that Jehovah once had a wife, right? I mean, Jehovah was deprived of his wife with the formation of the state of Israel, Judah, and so on, and it became an embarrassment. There's absolutely no doubt there was a goddess whom Jehovah took as a wife. Similarly, in early Greek mythology and religion, indeed, it's perfectly clear that Zeus is as the patriarchal monarch is a newcomer and a usurper, and there are these creatures called the Fates who once ruled the world and still, in the view of some people, rule it, and they are female, right? So all that stuff which fed this myth of matriarchy is actually true. It's true, and it's important that the metaphysical society is not patriarchal. Now, what happens, of course, is that it becomes patriarchal, and it achieves its height of patriarchality in a sense in the abstractions, because if you look at Plato and Aristotle, the metaphysical decline of the female is brought to its culmination in the conceptions of matter and form. So in the Timaeus, matter is female, form is male. In Aristotle, of course, form is God. Form is superior to matter. In the process of reproduction, the male provides the form and the female provides the matter. There's a whole range of associations like that. I say bring this process of the metaphysical diminution of the female to a conclusion from which it never really recovered, actually. I mean, it's that in a sense still hasn't recovered.
Yeah, so this is, and actually a lot of the stuff you're saying seems to be linked to Morgan's account, right? Like yeah. Morgan talks about how the like the killing of the Minotaur, like the Minotaur was representative of like the pre-Olympian like feminine order, right? So like Hercules has to go kill like the relics of this, and when Odysseus goes around to the different islands, like the goddesses are kind of in hiding, like they're running away from this and all. But I want to add actually about matrilineality and matriarchy. So yeah, Bakoffin had the idea of primitive matriarchy. Morgan just defends primitive matrilineality, which, you know, for Marx is sort of the scientific hypothesis. But I want to be clear about this. There has been a very sustained effort to deny the thesis of primitive matrilineality. So actually, I had to search a book on Jordan Peterson because, of course, he completely rejects this. He reads it in psychoanalytic terms. This is like the regression to the back to the mother. This kind of thing. But I have here A.R. Radcliffe's 1924 work, the mother's brother in South Africa. And in that, he criticizes Henry Unid's description of the residual matrilineal aspects of the Tonga of Mozambique as means of sentiment that had no bearing on its historical kinship structure. And this was sort of taken for a long time as the last word on this. And even George Murdoch's Ethnographic Atlas in 1967 reinforced this conviction, which I think has only more recently begun to be challenged in a serious way. Maybe you know more than I do about that particular controversy, but yeah, that's all I really wanted to say about that. But it reminded me of a quote when we're talking about, of course, the emergence of markets from the essay, right? It says, in Logic of Gender, it says, women have a problem with the market because the market has a problem with women, right? So I think it's very interesting to think about that in a larger historical frame. Does anyone have something they want to add? Do we have another observation here? Any thoughts? No? Okay, Luca, yeah.
Yeah, this is just, I think I want to see how to put this, but if we try to think of, because we had this discussion of matter and form and then how these get gendered really quickly, and I don't know, maybe this is, but I want to give this a try. If we take this notion of conception seriously, then and we can take anything, right? We can take food as an example, like what constitutes a meal, right? You could say that, of course, a lot of stuff goes into it, right? And then how would you gender that? Like at which point would you say that certain kind of ingredient, at what point does it, what triggers it being a meal instead of being like whatever, fruits and basically a whole ecology of life? At what point does it become the meal, and then at one point does it end being a meal? And if we think of the individual as sort of what is composed or what is conceived or what is whatever constituted, then I think that, I don't know if this is interesting to any of you, but I wanted to throw this in as a way to really get away from this binary understanding of gender.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if I understand, the point that's being made by Morgan and later sort of being made by Marx, it's that, you can't have, something like, we could say, well, today we have patriarchy, right? Well, why do we have patriarchy, right? And that has to do with, the emergence of markets, of commodity exchange, the capacity for certain individuals to profit, from the labor, be it market mediated or no, performed by others, right? The point about why we couldn't have matriarchy as such, right? Why that would be incorrect is because you can't take a context in which there's no capacity for wealth inequality, no capacity for marshaling that kind of force, like a foraging context, right? And say, oh, well, they just had matriarchy. So it's sort of like the inversion of patriarchy, right? To that. And that's where the matrilineality would be correct to the extent that it reflects, I mean, this is like way too complicated to get into like genteel structures and like Morgan and stuff like that. But matrilineality would be correct to the extent that if you take a sort of, rudimentary like foraging structure, it's like, how are you going to trace a family, right? And, very obviously, right, if you have a situation where monogamy isn't organized, I mean, the easiest way to do this is to say, well, yeah, that's the mother, right? And then that gets codified in ways that are actually very, very complex. But I think that's kind of the initial impulse, right? Which is why, at the point where patriarchy, as opposed to this earlier matrilineality, begins to be organized, it's also organized on the basis of this tremendous violence where women's sexuality has to be controlled, right? Because in order to establish the right of patrilineality, which becomes manifest as patriarchy in this context, that they're able to trace the lineage of the child, right? Which means that the woman can only be with one man. Though Engels also points out in The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, he says that we should be a little bit, because he had this debate with Marx, I think, because Marx was like, Marx tended to Marx had very monogamian sort of values. This is what I understand. He was always, with his wife, and he always accosted Engels for being with different women. He was like, "Why are you doing this? You don't live a respectable lifestyle." So Marx sort of imagined communism as like the perfection of monogamy, right? Where people could actually have meaningful monogamous relationships where they loved each other, where there weren't external pressures placed upon them. Whereas Engels imagined something maybe more radical, like the actual dissolution of monogamy within that context. And Engels says in The Origin of Family, Private Property in the State, he said, let's not kid ourselves with history. He said that, up until, really always, but more recently, maybe in Protestant societies, it's changed a bit. But almost always, monogamy has been monogamy for women, right? Not monogamy for men. And that's attested to by the perennial existence of, a class of lower class women who are prostitutes in all these societies, right? To serve the sexual needs of those men who actually are not monogamous, right? So I think those are all really, really crucial points. Does anyone want to jump in at this point?
Based on what you just said, it's beginning to occur to me that it's the category of monogamy more than gender that's the external constraint. That's what you're beginning to suggest.
Could you elaborate on that a bit? I'm just like,
Well, yeah, I'm elaborating on what you're saying, which is that the kind of marketization of women begins with the imposition of monogamy in the service of organizing the property value of the offspring. And so that becomes, based on what you're saying and your kind of summary of Morgan and Engels, that becomes, it's the problem of monogamy as a root social structure that then becomes imposed on women, which then contributes to the way in which it's the beginning of property as such. Offspring and family understood as property. But no, I can't, that's just the sense I'm getting from your comments, that would be another place to locate the external constraint that then comes to define the status of women historically.
Well, maybe the most interesting and maybe the most provocative part of all of The Origin of Family, Private Property in the State is when Engels, in spite of, I said, essentializing in certain respects the strong century family, when he talks about ancient history, when Engels states that, it's in the moment of monogamy, right? And the designation of these roles, that the woman becomes this oppressed social class, right? And it's when he uses that social language of class, right, to actually talk about that. And then he draws as he kind of just talks about women as sort of proto-proletariat. And I found it very striking because I wrote this essay criticizing Nina Power a while ago in her presentation in Skopje she gave on some of these subjects. But I found it very interesting that Nina Power, in her sort of defense of this more Marxist humanist, but also sort of transphobic and essentialist conception of sex, also she said, well, I must reject this comment by Engels, right? So she actually has to take, the most radical aspect of Engels' analysis out, in order to drive to her point. Luca, did you have your hand up? Yeah? No? Okay, Paul,
No,
do you want to do Paul? Yeah?
well,
Oh, sorry,
Luca,
Luca, do you want to talk?
that this
Yeah.
is, that's, I think that, yeah, exactly. This whole notion of I think this is, I would put it in spatial terms, right? That becoming the domestication basically of social life, right, is at the heart and crux of the capitalist everything, right? The whole way that property is being handed down generations, the whole way that inputs and outputs are calculated is entirely based on, this. It begins with the notion that this is my house and here are its inputs and then outputs, and I think that's really, for me, that's the heart and center of the critique of both. That's where the gender and capital are inextricable. And the moment that domestication is the condition of possibility of the whole shenanigans, basically. Yeah.
Paul, do you want to?
Go on.
John has a question.
Oh, John, sorry.
Good. Sorry. I just want to comment back to Luca's first point when he was on about Kant and nearly giving birth to concepts. Used to do it. The book was it the Dictionary of Untranslatable Terms? It's a philosophical dictionary that Barbara Cassin does, but it's very interesting. She traces back the root of the term concept, which goes back to I think concetto, and it means or concetto, but it has ideas of conception in it to get a mental representation. But interestingly, that's a more modern concept than the idea of abstraction, which goes back before Aristotle, but it's like that there's a real, I don't know, that they're quite different terms, or like how you connect them up. Like the work of abstraction is a different work to creating a concept, just if that adds to what Luca was on about that. And it's really worth looking up just the difference between the concept and where they come about. Because there is also like this giving birth in the concept, which is interesting, but not an abstraction. Abstraction is separation, negating from things, getting rid of particulars and quantifying. So that's my.
Sure, very good. Paul?
I was just getting a little bit concerned when we were beginning to have discussions about whether private property or commodification and so forth are the generators of gender, if we are to use it amongst the critical language of real abstraction. First of all, because I think there are different historical periods and notably different spatial spaces within historical conjunctures where those things have not been present, and yet there have still been power relationships. And what we tend to do is, I think we're trying to avoid it, but nevertheless it comes in. It comes in that when we begin to actually generalize our own societies, which is very problematic. And in that respect, I think it is the nexus of property, commodity, value, the dislocation of exchange from use. It's those things in a nexus to me which are at the core of what real abstraction adds. I'm quite willing to accept, or far better qualified and knowledgeable than me, that historically Sohn-Rethel might have prioritized X or Y. But I think it is the nexus and interaction of those categories, what I would call in general the material conditions of social life, that are always behind all of these struggles. So they're always there. They're necessary interactions and lineages and causal power are important, but it's the fact they operate as a nexus, one reinforcing the other. And that in that context, that's gender as real abstraction, because gender relations are concretely within that structure and nexus, as are all social relations under capitalism. And I wouldn't necessarily speculate as to whether or not we could use the same theoretical tools prior to capitalism, but I'm willing to accept arguments either way, likewise with the global south.
Okay, and Richard, you want to intervene as well?
No.
Okay.
The moment is fine.
Okay. Does anyone have anything to add? Because I can say something to Paul, but I just wondered if anyone wanted to jump in now and say something. No. Okay. So Paul, I feel like I have to be writing these things out, but I think when people talk about because as surely as Sohn-Rethel in Intellectual and Manual Labor talks about unilateral appropriation and the relationship of that to real abstraction, I think the argument would be, if we're talking about private property, or not in a judicial sense necessarily, but private property and the beginnings of commodification, I think the argument would be that in the same way that we can elucidate the development of the commodity structure in history, by virtue of its sort of apotheosis within capitalism, that you can also look at, the development of this nexus, as you call it, up to that point. So I don't know, it becomes sort of a tricky question about where you, where you draw the line with real abstraction. I mean, I don't know, for example, and I've said this before, like I think that when Sohn-Rethel, I think when he talks about ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, I think maybe he goes too far in differentiating the two. Of course, we know that there were markets in ancient Egypt. They had units of account. We know that there were class divisions and so forth, that the economic activity of those societies can't be subsumed under the mantra of appropriation. So I just meant, I think that it's important to recognize what you're saying, but maybe also important to adopt a transitive model of history when we approach this question, right? Which would have an impact on how we approach questions of gender. When you say also about relations of power emerging without the conception of gender and of gender avant la lettre, I should say, I'm a little bit curious to what you would be talking about. Because I mean, I could be mistaken, but I would just have a hard time pointing to societies in which you have, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just like spectacularly wrong. And you're gonna tell me why. But even when we get things like plowshare agriculture and the capacity for tribute and the thinking in terms of a type of social reproduction, I have a hard time imagining societies which developed along those lines absent some kind of structural designation for people who are charged with, for instance, taking care of children. I would think that a lot of the exceptions you would cite would be more, even tribal or not. I hesitate to say at that point, but different in character. So that would be all I had to say. Anyone have anything they want to say now? Paul, did you want to respond, or anyone else?
I think I was primarily making a caution as to us making too broader statements without recognizing that while we necessarily need, in order to make specific arguments, certain concepts to be accentuated, and of course implicitly we're doing that with commodity, with a sort of Marxist toolbox that Sohn-Rethel draws. At the same time, I would just want us to be a little bit careful that we're not sweeping everything into that. I haven't got examples. I mean, to give you one example, that's contrast, but it's still gendered to an extent. There are peoples in East Africa, across places like Kenya, former Tanzania, because they don't recognize those boundaries, where adults go out and work agriculturally and grandparents bring up the kids. I'm not going to say that isn't gendered. All I'm saying is I want us to be a little bit careful as to the universality of the claims we make, because my reading of real abstraction is that it's to caution us against those universals.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it goes to show, it just, gets back to what I was saying with the complexity of this in terms of, if we talk about labor, right? Just as if we talk about gender or money, right? There's a concrete form of that, which we can observe in our own society. And I think we have to be very attentive to the fact that when we apply those to past societies, that we risk a sort of anachronism. So I guess we're at 9:15 now, right? So that's about time, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Does anyone have any final observations they'd like to make? Final comments about the discussion? Oh, okay. So much for participating. Again, we apologize for Maya's absence, though she did add that she'll probably contribute to the upcoming book that we're going to do with essays from the conference. So you will get to read at that point what she would have said if she had been here.